So I've had a few Pokemon projects that I've been slowly working on for years now, and they've always been things that I figured I'll finish eventually. There was never really any reason to rush. If I got distracted by another game for a while or just didn't feel like working on the Pokedex for the next few months, it didn't matter. Everything would still be there whenever I decided to come back to it. Then, Pokemon Bank got an end date. On February 25th, 2027, Pokemon Bank shuts down. Forever. And once that happens, the last official connection between the old games and Pokemon Home, it shuts down with it. So all of those things that I said I'd get around to eventually, apparently eventually is now. And I've got quite a bit left to do. The biggest thing I'm working on is my Living Dex. Although I've made the whole thing a little bit more complicated than it probably needs to be. I don't just want one of every Pokemon sitting at home. If that was the only goal, there are much faster ways to do this. I could catch most of them in the newer games, trade for whatever I'm missing, or pull some from Pokemon Go. And eventually I'd have every box filled. But I want the collection to have a little more history behind it than that. When I got started on Kanto, for example, I went back to Fire Red and Leaf Green and built that collection there. As much as possible, I want these Pokemon to come from the games and generations that they actually represent. I want them caught by me, on my saves, and then brought forward from there. So, when I go through those boxes in Home, I'm not just looking at Bulbasaur, Charmander, or Squirtle that happens to fill the right spot in that Pokedex. I can look at them and know that that one came from my Fire Red save, or my Leaf Green save, and I actually brought it all the way here. I know that doesn't really change what the Pokemon is, but for me, it makes the collection feel a lot more personal. And Kanto is done. I finished some of the newer parts of the collection here too. I've been able to finish Galar and Paldea, with the exception of Zarude. It's everything that's in between those generations that becomes the problem. Because I still have work to do in Johto, Hoenn, Sinnoh, Unova, Kalos, and Alola. 6 generations of games where there are still Pokemon I want to catch, projects I need to finish, or things I want to make sure that don't get left behind. And until now, none of that really had a time limit. Now I have 6 generations in 6 months. The problem is that Pokemon from these games can't just go straight into Home, the way Pokemon from the Switch games can. Depending on where they started, there's an entire chain of games and transfer systems that they have to move through. But eventually, they all end up in the same place, Pokemon Bank. And once Pokemon Bank shuts down, that connection between Pokemon Home and Bank is gone forever. And at that point, I can't come back in a couple of years and find something sitting on an old save and think, oh yeah, I should probably bring that forward. If there's something in these games that I want to keep, I need to make that decision now. I think part of the reason I've gotten so attached to doing the collection this way is that Pokemon has always been unusually good at letting you keep a history with something. You can catch a Pokemon in a game that's 20 years old and move it through several generations and systems and different pieces of hardware, and somehow that same Pokemon can still end up with you in one of the games you're playing today. Obviously, the graphics change, the games change, but the Pokemon itself can keep moving forward. It's what separates Pokemon from other franchises, and I really like that. There's something different about looking at Pokemon and Home and knowing that it isn't just the same species as the one you used years ago. It actually is that Pokemon. That's a big part of what I'm trying to preserve before Bank goes away. And it's also why the other project I'm working on has suddenly become a lot more important. These are my Ribbon Masters. And yes, if you're noticing a theme here, I clearly have a type. They're all ice types. The basic idea behind a Ribbon Master is pretty easy to explain. You take one Pokemon through the games it's able to travel through and collect all the ribbons available to it along the way. Actually doing that is where things get a little less simple. Depending on where that Pokemon starts, you're talking about things like Mount Battle in Pokemon XD, contests, battle towers, and other facilities, champion ribbons and challenges spread across several generations of games. So I've been using this tracker to keep everything organized. which probably gives you a better idea of how much is involved rather than me explaining every single ribbon. And the important part is with these, progression is mostly one way. Once I move a Pokemon forward, there are older games and ribbons that it can't go back to. So before Bank shuts down, I don't just need to get these Pokemon transferred. I need to make sure they're actually finished with everything I need to do with them first. This is Yuki. Yuki's probably the best example of why I've gotten so invested in all of this. She's a shiny Snorunt I brought through the older games as a Ribbon Master, and eventually she became the Frostlass that I still use now. She's my partner Pokemon. There have been a lot of games between those two versions of her, but it's still the same Yuki. And when I look through her ribbons now, that's basically a record of that whole journey. Where we've been, what we've done, and all these little pieces of Pokemon history that would be impossible to recreate on just a Frostlass that I caught today. Yuki's already made it safely into home, but I still have other Ribbon Masters working their way through the older generations, and that's where the bank deadline gets a little uncomfortable. If I miss something with the Living Dex, there's at least a chance I can find another way to get that species later. If I move one of these Pokemon forward without a ribbon I needed to earn, that's it. It can't be a Ribbon Master. So I need to be a little more careful with these. So once the bank announcement happened, I finally had to stop thinking about all of these as separate little projects and actually look at everything together. And when I did, yeah, there's a lot. There's the Living Dex, the Ribbon Masters, and there are Pokemon sitting on old saves that I just want to make sure come forward. And then there are 6 generations of games where I still have things that I want to finish before the door closes. I can still always go back and play those games whenever I want, but the experiences and the journeys that I take with those Pokemon will be stuck. For now, I'm starting with Johto. I've already been back in Heart Gold and Soul Silver figuring out exactly where I left everything and how much of the collection I already have. It's definitely not starting from scratch. I've got a team, there's already a decent amount sitting in the PC, and I've made another run through the Elite Four while I've been getting reacquainted with the save. I've also started filling in some of the things I'm missing. Although, I've already learned that trying to do this efficiently and playing Heart Gold don't necessarily go together. Because of course Entei shows up when I'm not ready. And obviously, once that happened, whatever I had actually been doing stopped mattering. And he does what Entei does. Bye, Entei. It took a while, but I eventually found him again and was a little bit more prepared this time. Is any of this the fastest possible way to finish a Living Dex? Probably not. But honestly, this is exactly the kind of stuff I want this project to include. If I only cared about getting to the end as fast as possible, I wouldn't be going back and playing these games in the first place. So, over the next several months, I'm going to be working my way through as much of this as I can. The Living Dex, the Ribbon Masters, old Pokemon I don't want to leave behind. Whatever ends up coming out of these saves as I just go through them. But I don't really want these videos to just become progress reports where I tell you I caught another 40 Pokemon and then show you a box. The number isn't really the interesting part. It's everything that happens while I'm trying to get there. Going back to places that I haven't seen in years. Finding Pokemon I forgot I had. Remembering why I liked some of these games as much as I did. And sometimes realizing that one particular Pokemon has ended up meaning a lot more to me than I ever expected it to. And that's the stuff I want to make videos about. The collection gives me reason to go back. Whatever happens while I'm there, that's the journey. This also ended up being a good excuse to start making videos again. I actually used to upload on this channel years ago. Mostly it was Rainbow Six Siege stuff back then. But eventually I stopped playing Siege. Life got busy. One way or another, I just stopped making videos. And then somehow, 8 years went by. I've thought about coming back to it plenty of times, but I've never really had something to make me think, yeah, that's what I want to start with. Apparently Pokemon Bank shutting down was enough to do it. I'm not trying to turn this into a Pokemon news channel, and Pokemon isn't necessarily going to be the only thing I talk about here either. I just miss making things. And I still spend way too much of my free time getting invested in games, collections, long-running projects, and completely unnecessary goals like this that I care way more about than I probably should. So that's where things stand. 6th generation still needing work, a handful of ribbon masters to make it through safely, and a lot of old Pokemon games that I'm about to spend a lot of time with again. In about 6 months to do it, before Pokemon Bank closes forever. I might have to change the plan. I genuinely don't know if I'm going to be able to finish everything that I want to. And there are probably parts of it that I've forgotten about completely. Definitely some more difficult to catch Pokemon that I'm planning for. And I'm sure at some point I'm going to discover something that makes this whole project even more complicated than I thought it was. But that's kind of what makes me want to do it. So if this sounds like the ridiculously specific Pokemon project you'd enjoy following, I'm inviting you along for the journey. For now, I'm starting here. Johto first. I've got some Pokemon to catch.